Welcome back to Latin. Today we're going to start a new chapter. That chapter is chapter 24 in the Wheelock textbook. The first concept we're going to talk about is ablative absolute. Let's start by looking at its job. An ablative absolute exists as a way of setting the scene for the rest of the sentence. It will present basically under what circumstances the action in the sentence is occurring. So let's start by looking at what it looks like in Latin. Ablative absolute, as you can guess, is going to have an ablative noun. It's also going to use an ablative participle. I know some of you are feeling a little less comfortable with participles, and we'll have the opportunity to practice them a lot as we go through this chapter. All right, next thing. Even though this is going to form a participial phrase, when we translate it, we're going to use a subordinate clause in English. Next, unlike other subordinate clauses, such as relative clauses, the ablative absolute is going to have no antecedent. We call it absolute because it is separated or isolated from the rest of the sentence. Not in the sense that there's no relationship between ablative absolute and the rest of the sentence, but it's not saying something like Caesar, who was the general, came from Rome, right? In that case, the subordinate clause, who was the general, is tied directly to the main clause, and that's not the case with ablative absolute. You could remove the ablative absolute from the sentence. Well, you could do this with any subordinate clause. Never mind. Moving on. So, like other participial phrases, you may find that the ablative absolute is going to make a Latin sandwich. This is also sometimes referred to as the frame. So, that means that an ablative absolute may only have the ablative noun or ablative participle, or it could also have a direct object, an indirect object, another prepositional phrase, etc. Basically anything you could find in a sentence sandwiched in between the ablative noun and the ablative participle. Or if you prefer to think about it as a frame, the ablative noun would act as the left side of the frame. The picture is all the other stuff, and the ablative participle is the right side of the frame. One way you can identify this is by looking at the participle and seeing if the participle agrees with the ablative in case number gender. If it does, then you likely have an ablative absolute. Another thing that's really nice, a lot of textbook editors will set the ablative absolute apart from the rest of the sentence by a comma, even though the Romans did not use commas. Because we do in English, a lot of textbook authors and editors, again, will clue you into the ablative absolute by the use of a comma. And last but not least, the ablative absolute, the participle, can be in any tense or voice. Okay, now we're going to look at the relationship between the ablative noun and the ablative participle. When we translate the ablative noun and participle as a subordinate clause, the noun is going to function as the subject, and the participle is going to function as the verb. Let's take a look at a couple of examples. I did tell you that the participle can be any tense or voice. That is true. However, ablative absolutes are almost always going to be either with a present active participle or a perfect passive participle. Those are the only two we're going to practice because those are really basically the only two you're going to see. So, milite amante. I've got my ablative noun, milite, from the noun miles militis, meaning soldier, and amante from the present active participle amans amantis. If I'm doing a literal translation of any ablative absolute, then I can always start with the preposition with. Think ablative with. And again, it's setting up the scene or saying, what circumstances. And the circumstances here are with the soldier loving. This could just be milite amante, or the phrase could also include a direct object, milite eam amante, with the soldier loving her, anything like that. Either way, it sets up the scene or the circumstances that the action in the main clause is going to be happening under. Now, in English, we don't use participial phrases very much. We use dependent clauses instead. So, even though with the soldier loving is 100% correct, it's a good translation, it's a literal translation, it's not very natural to our English language patterns. So, there are other ways that you can translate this. Because the soldier loves, when or while the soldier loves, and although the soldier loves. You will know which option is the best because when, while, although, depending on the context of the sentence and the context of what's happening if you're reading something longer in the passage. So you have to look at the relationship between the circumstances and the action that comes after in order to help you figure out what the best translation would be. Let's take a look next at perfect passive. So we have our example, milite amato. In our example, again, we've got our ablative noun, milite, and now we have our perfect passive participle, amato. Notice how amato agrees with milite in case, number, and gender. So again, the participle is going to agree with the ablative noun in case, number, and gender. If we're going for a literal translation, we're going to start with the preposition with the soldier, and now our participle, having been loved. With the soldier, having been loved. And again, that's not the most natural English language pattern, so there are a few different translation options you could do. You could say, because the soldier was loved. You could say, when or while the soldier was loved. You could also say, although the soldier was loved. You're going to know which translation is best, again, depending on rule number 1, depending on the context. Last thing we're going to talk about, just like in participial phrases, with ablative absolute phrases, tense is relative, meaning that when you translate the participle, the translation is going to change depending on the context of the main clause. I don't want you guys to worry about that right now because I'm going to make another video that walks you through it. Right now, we're just going to focus on all the different ways that you could translate an ablative absolute phrase. If you have any questions, please check in during office hours or send me an email, and I would love to go over it with you.